everyone, thanks for tuning in today. So this video actually will be me kind of redoing the speech that I did at DevCon4, which is an annual conference that's hosted by the Ethereum Foundation, and it took place this week in Prague. And I was lucky enough to be able to present on a topic that is very near and dear to my own heart, and the title of it is Lessons from International Law, Lessons that we can bring into crypto governance. Obviously, very ambitious title, but I'm glad that I did get to speak a little bit about that. Also, this is a fairly long talk, and so I hope you'll forgive me for actually holding up my script here because that definitely helps me, and I did not get a chance to memorize my entire talk. The transcript of this will also be online. I'll post a link below if you want to just sort of read it as you listen to the audio. I won't be offended. I just figured, if you're an audio or visual learner, whichever way helps, I just wanted to kind of have an option out there. So without further ado, here it is. So let's start with a question. As we think about the future of crypto, about Web3, about crypto's impact on society, sometimes it helps to bring the discussion back to basics and think about this question. What is it about the current state of the world and its governance structure do we want to change? Does it need to be changed? My goal, of course, is not to present an answer to the above questions, but rather to develop a framework and provide more nuanced context for all of us to think through. So with that, here's where I want to start the discussion today, to look at the history, formation, and evolution of public international law. So international law consists of the framework and infrastructure in which foreign affairs of states are conducted. So that includes 1. The institutions, form, and procedure for daily activity. 2. The assumptions on which the society is founded. 3. The concepts which permeate the society. And 4. The various relations between the society's individual state members. The infrastructure of all of those agreed upon assumptions, practices, commitments, expectations, and reliance is all part of international law. This is important to crypto because the crypto community is very much also a global community. Quick history lesson. The Peace or Treaty of Westphalia, which was signed in 1648, was the treaty that ended the 30-Year War. That's the 17th century war that was fought primarily in Central Europe and one of the more destructive conflicts in the history of the world. For purposes of our discussion today, though, 2 important things resulted from that treaty. First, this is the birth of the modern state from an international relations perspective. It became clear that the primary origin of the international discourse was the nation state. That nation state was defined in a critical way, which is that the state is sovereign. What happens in the border of a state is subject to the control of that state and that state only. Secondly, it gave rise to the notion of the sovereign equality of the states. This meant that, in theory, no matter the realities of economic disparity, in the eyes of the law, all states were considered to be equal. No state has greater power to sit in judgment over the other. So the Treaty of Westphalia created sovereign states in theory, and from there on out, customary law, which is the practice that is reinforced through both consistent practice and common understanding of the international community, developed very fast. Customary law is one way from which international law derives its source of power. Of course, the question is this: how does international law, on a global scale, even gets enforced? Generally speaking, there are 2 types of enforcement mechanisms: horizontal and vertical. Enforcement mechanisms are clear-cut, where governance is vertical. So an authority like Congress imposes a rule like insider trading is illegal. That law is then reinforced by the relevant government regulator, like the SEC or the DOJ, with harsh penalties for non-compliance. As a result, individual traders have an incentive to comply with the law and to avoid the risks that are associated with trading based on material and non-public information. The challenges, however, arise when governance is horizontal. And here we face the biggest criticism of international law, which is that it's not real. Or rather, how does it even get enforced? International law does not have a central lawmaker because we do not have a world police force or world government, so there's no mandatory vertical governance in this instance. Some skeptics of international law base that skepticism about international law on the absence of a comprehensive judicial system with compulsory jurisdiction to settle disputes, and the absence of a central executive to enforce compliance with the judicial system's decisions. I disagree. I think that the emphasis on a global court or a global police force is misleading. In fact, international law derives its binding force from sources other than courts and a police force. States comply with international law out of expectations of reciprocity or retaliation if they do not apply, or out of a belief that law is morally legitimate and therefore ought to be obeyed. So, for example, effective sanctions exist without the need for a centralized adjudication and enforcement agency. But mostly, I want to point to the formation of customary international law, which is the practice that is reinforced through consistent practice and common understanding of the international community. Which also, by the way, remains a highly effective one. For the record, I'm not addressing other sources of international law like treaties, which act more like written agreements or contracts. So again, customary international law are formed from a general and consistent practice of states that is followed by states out of a sense of obligation. So what the right thing to do is. It's agreement and consensus among members and states first, and the establishment of governing rules second. For example, because it is a fundamental legal principle that each state is sovereign, it is logically necessary, and thus customary international law, that the sovereignty of each state extends throughout that state's borders. Lawyers and other people typically assume that the only binding rules are those made by legislatures and by courts. But we tend to forget that law can also be made by the consent of communities of people, without formal enactment by government entities. In fact, such customs or practices are not even written down sometimes. Customary international law is a signal source of strength and of flexibility for international law. It allows international actors to develop rules of behavior informally without the need to resort to formal lawmaking by a central body. All right, so what's an example of the sort of consistent practice and common understanding from the community can we bring into crypto governance? Well, first, we need standards. There's something that I read once which emphasizes the importance of values, and it goes like this. It might be possible for two equally effective governance systems to compete by internalizing different values. One could perhaps embrace openness and diversity at the cost of some efficiency, and the other could be optimized for efficiency for a more homogeneous set of users and interests. So whether that's the crypto industry working out a global taxonomy that makes sense, or standardizing the very minimal amount of disclosure information that should be demanded from token projects, either before, during, or after their token sale, it's about figuring out those values that the community can agree on and pushing those forward. So to bring all of this back to the criticism of international law for a second. Ultimately, the critics of international law are asking the wrong questions. What matters is not whether international law has the exact same legislative, judicial, and executive branches that domestic states do internally. What matters is whether international law is reflected in the behavior of the states. The question is also not whether there is a formal judiciary. Instead, the question is whether disputes are resolved in orderly and peaceful fashion in accordance with international law, which they mostly are. Most importantly, the question is not whether the law is enforceable. The question is whether or not the law is actually de facto observed, and whether it influences the behavior of states. Nations have accepted important limitations on their sovereignty. They have observed the norms set out by the global community, and the result is substantial order. It's not perfect, it's not optimal, but substantial in international life. So in reality, the actual international system is a hybrid of two theories. Norms are formed by treaty and by consent. Therefore, the actual international system is a compromise point between those two theories. So over the course of the past couple days, and also obviously a lot online, I've overheard conversations that go something like this. We don't give a damn about governance and their laws because we're building Web3. And I think that's just kind of a misunderstanding of what we're really striving to work towards here. We're working to empower sovereign equality in individuals. We're working to create incentives for human cooperation. We're working to create good citizenship among the global community. Governance is a bottom-up approach. Goals and values go hand in hand, but are created from ongoing community consensus more than predefined rules. Technology may move the discussion forward and give us a framework to build upon, but governance is not a ground zero issue. At the end of the day, it's about human behavior. Thank you. Okay, and that's the end of it. I know it's super high level, but hopefully somewhat thought-provoking. Again, the transcript to this will be in the link in the box below. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any additional thoughts on this. This was super fun for me to write. I'm sorry if this is a little bit boring, but I I enjoyed the opportunity to really be able to present this. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you guys sometime soon.